Oh,
Even says it there. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Contemporary Issues class. We are happy to be here in person with about 15 people and on Zoom with 7 people. And we are happy fall is here, October 3, and there's some light snow on the mountains. Out behind us here, Mount Evans has got some snow, so fall is here. Yes. And we are excited today to be trying out some a new device for Zooming better. It's called an owl. I can't show it to you on Zoom, you folks see it because I can't turn my computer that way, but it's shaped like a little white sitting on a table. It rotates, it has a camera and the microphone in it, and it rotates. So you'll see back up here, it'll split screen sometimes and will show you when you're talking. So when you say something, do it loud and it will pick up your voice. It's kind of like our smart speakers at phone. It follows you at home. It follows you around the room and picks up your voice, but this also has a camera. So it will show that. And this is our first time, so we're winging it and we'll see how this works. So our usual announcements, please, Zoomers, please mute yourself in the lower left corner of your screen so we can keep down the background noise, and unmute when you want to speak. And we are recording this today for future playback of those who missed the class and want to see it later. And please be kind to our speaker who has spent some time preparing a good lesson for us today. And we are excited to have Doug here. Any other announcements? Things going on at church today? We have a big meeting at 11:30, the state of the church, we call it sometimes, talking about the goals and how all the programs are doing at the church. So that will be good to catch up on how things are here since we just came back in person. And,
I'd like to comment on that.
Yeah.
If you're not going to be there in person, you can go to the church webpage, open that up, and go down to the web bar and sign in to the web bar and register to watch that on the web bar. They're not going to Zoom it, but it's going to be a web bar presentation. And they
Good.
didn't say anything about that in church or how you could attend it or any emails on how you could attend it. You weren't going to be there, but you can do that. That's what it says on our webpage.
Good to know. We're all kind of learning with these new technologies coming out of COVID lockdown. We're trying to learn, right? Doug? That's
hey,
right.
how come that thing didn't pick him up?
It did pick up Terry. Well, Terry's talking on Zoom and it talked through the owl.
Yeah, Jerry on the screen.
Yeah, we heard him.
Yeah, we heard him.
Yeah.
I didn't see him though.
He's
on the
up
screen.
there.
He
He's on the
just
screen.
stays on the screen. He's right there on the screen.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
he
Oh.
stayed, yeah.
There we go. But when you all talk, it should show up and show a little closer picture of you.
Okay.
Okay. We're finding our way.
Confused out.
Okay, any other announcements?
Yeah.
Things going on. All righty. Well, today we're going to have an unusual topic. I think a good topic, a great course. You all know the great courses probably. And this one is a little challenging of the traditional Christian view of the Trinity. And it's by a historian. Doug will explain that, saying that in his opinion, Jesus wasn't God. He was a man who was blessed by God in so many ways, but during his lifetime, he was not seen by the disciples as being equal to God. And this all came about afterwards, in the couple hundred years afterwards, as the church struggled to try and identify exactly what Jesus' nature was. So Doug and I hope that you all will be comfortable with questioning the faith this way. And in fact, Rev Mark just had a sermon 2 weeks ago called The Skeptic, and said that, if you can't question your faith, you're in a bad place. It's all right to question and learn. It's how we learn, is by questioning and listening to historians and others. And so That's the thought here. And so we're not giving our opinion, but this is more of a book and a course review of this historian. And let me just introduce Doug for a minute. He's a hiking buddy of mine, and he's a member of St. Andrew and for many years, and is very involved in the youth program and gone on mission trips with the youth. And he presented in our class last year on forest firefighting because he was a smoke jumper in his earlier life. And now he is a snow ski instructor at Copper Mountain in his winter days. And so he's a man of many skills, and loves to read widely and present classes on things. And so
What's his last name?
Doug Knispel.
K-N-I-S, it's German, K-N-I-S-P-E-L.
Thanks.
And Doug lives in Glenwood, in Georgetown, but comes down here to church to do a lot of things, and came to be with us today. So thank you, Doug, for doing this.
Okay. Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
For those that were in my firefighting lecture, this is a little bit different than firefighting in terms of that. Let me start out and what I am not. I am not a theologian. I am not a biblical scholar. I'm going to be quoting from Bart Ehrlichman's book here that we'll talk about in a moment. If I interject anything of my own feelings, I will qualify that. If I interject anything of his personal feelings, I will qualify that. Otherwise, it'll be a straight book review in terms of this. This is going to be a study of the historical Jesus, which is not necessarily the spiritual Jesus, as we might know. And it's based upon historical research and content that has been found about him, and which therefore realizes that there's some things we do not know or that we can question about. Both ways you might look at it. It's going to be fast in certain spots because there's a heck of a lot to go through. I will skim through some stuff real quick, and then I'll slow down once we get into the content, the real meaty content, you might say, in terms of this. Go
And
ahead.
Doug, you've said also that you're glad to take questions during the
Yeah.
presentation. We're
Yeah.
informal here, so just raise your hand and say, what about that? And then Doug will stop it sometimes here in the presentation, and we'll have a little more discussion.
One thing that some of you may relate to is that I'm struggling. I just found out recently I've been struggling quite badly with cataracts. So if I start to get real close on some sort of stuff like that, forgive me. But I mean, it's taken me forever to get in to see a doctor to get this thing taken care of in terms of that. And right now things are still a little bit cloudy, you might say, and I'm sure some of you have had that. But hopefully it was good results. Okay. Let me introduce Bart Ehrlichman that we're talking about over here. He is a scholar that teaches at the university at Chapel Hill University of North Carolina. He's been there since 1988. He's extremely well known within the biblical world, although in some places controversial for his views, which I'll see if introduce a little bit now. Let me start about that. He started out as a fundamentalist Christian. He went to Moody Bible Institute. He went door to door trying to convert non-Christians to being Christians. He has turned and evolved over the 40 or so years that he's been around teach-wise into a non-believer, basically, but he believes that Jesus was a person, is what it boils down to. Okay, so he's made a 180 in terms of that. However, he's very, very careful in his books and research to disseminate his own personal feelings from what he's talking about. So he will throw them into the book, but he'll qualify that. And so I will do the same thing in terms of that when he talks in that. He's presenting a historical overview in terms of this. And so again, there's going to be some conflict with what our beliefs only because of that. He's written 30 books, 600 New York Times bestsellers. He's written 3 college textbooks. Very, very well known in, again, the biblical scholar world in terms of that. There's a couple phrases I'm going to read real quickly out of the book, just paraphrasing from this. Ehrlichman writes with vigor and clarity, but above all with intellectual honesty, by John Collins, who's a professor of the Old Testament at Yale. Another one is tracing the development understanding of Jesus from a fully human apocalyptic preacher to a fully divine being. Ehrlichman shows his skills as an interpreter of both biblical and non-biblical texts. This is an important, accessible work by a scholar of the first rank, and this is by Michael Cohen, who's Harvard Divinity School. Weren't you more, Bart Ehrlichman made a career of zeroing in on some of the most difficult questions at the intersection of faith and history. And then basically candid, and that's from the Boston Globe. And this one is candid and direct. It unfolds, which often seem to be the unnecessarily complicated controversies that have divided early Christians in a fair and understandable manner. And it's what he tries to do, is try to be fair and understandable about it. So let's just slide one real quick, Steve, and show you what, and as I do that, one thing on my background, I was at St. Luke's many years ago, and I ran into a guy called Fred Venerable. I don't know if anybody knew. Fred was here a long time ago, a tall, lanky minister that passed away not that long ago. He turned me on to a book called Remedial Christianity. And in this book, there was two quotes that I've always remembered. One of which was, a faith that is not worth questioning is a faith not worth having. And then the second one, which I really love, is never have people felt so strongly about something they knew so little about. Which is probably a classic with religion, because you get a lot of people that are, fire and brimstone, and they can't know the first 5 books of the Bible. And Ehrlichman is really big on that. He says, I will talk to you tomorrow about biblical scholar or biblical issues, but you've got to do some research on your own too, in terms of this. So I thought those are both pretty interesting in terms of that. I'm going to skip over the introduction. I'm going to skip chapters 2 and 3, divine humans in the ancient Grecian world and divine humans in within ancient Judaism. I'm going to briefly go over that because you need to understand the context of the first century in Palestine and what's kind of the feelings of people there and the things that were going on there at that time. The meat will begin on chapter 4. Did Jesus think he was God? 5, the resurrection of Jesus, what we cannot know. The resurrection of Jesus, what we can know. The beginning of Christology, which is the understanding and study of Jesus. These are going to be the meaty chapters. This talks about basically post-crucifixion and leading up to the Council of Nicaea. Are you familiar with the Council of Nicaea?
Yep.
Okay, basically, which became the official stand of basically what Jesus was. And it came up with the Nicene Creed, which was meant to basically disavow many of the controversies that occurred prior to that in the 300 years that it took to get to that point, which is outlined in 8 and 9 here in terms of this. All the debate that was going on over exactly what was Jesus, in terms of this. And then it didn't become official though to the Council of Chalcedon, which was I got a date on that, on 451. So basically, in the 4th century, before it really came out with the official statement of that Jesus was God. So it's taken them 300 plus years, almost 400 years to basically come up with this resolution. So and the interesting part is it's still debated today, 2,000 years later in terms of that. So that's going to be our outline in terms of that. I'm going to start and I'm also going to be quoting a lot from the book. And the reason for it is, again, this is a sensitive topic to some, controversial, obviously, and I don't want to misquote anything. So let me read you something that begins in this talking about the ancient world in terms of this. Before he was born, his mother had a visitor from heaven who told her that her son would not be a mere mortal, but in fact would be divine. His birth was accompanied by unusual divine signs in heaven. As an adult, he left his home to engage on a preaching ministry. He went from village to town, telling all those that would listen that they should not be concerned about their earthly lives and their material goods. They should live for what was spiritual and eternal. He gathered a number of followers around him who became convinced that he was no ordinary human, but that he was the Son of God. And he did miracles to confirm them in their beliefs that he could heal the sick, cut out demons, and raise the dead. At the end of his life, he arose opposition among the ruling authorities of Rome and was put on trial, but they could not kill his soul. That sound like somebody you know? Okay, all right. Turn that flip over for me if you don't, since you do that. The gentleman here that we're talking about, and Steve is going to be my linguist and help me with pronunciations over here. Apollos?
Excuse me just a second,
Yeah.
Doug, too. Let me turn the
All
owl
around?
a
Okay,
little
sure.
bit because it's not picking up your picture.
Oh, okay.
So,
Yeah, I'm
so
gonna move this
let
out of the
me-
way.
Excuse me for just a second, folks. I want to make sure this looks and sounds okay for the folks on Zoom too. There, that's a little better. For some reason, it wasn't focused on you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, there we go.
So Apollonius, at least that's why I pronounce it, or close to it, basically, was a guy that lived around in the 1st century. And there was some books written about him in the 2nd century, like 8 different volumes, and historians have interestingly tried to confirm him or compare him and Jesus. But the point of this whole thing is there was a lot of people like that in the 1st century. There really was. What differentiated Jesus from the rest of them was the crucifixion and the resurrection thereafter. But again, that was very common, and that's what I want to talk about is this interaction between divines and humans in the 1st century. That'll be the lead. Do we have a slide in this next one on the 3 models? No, we don't. 3 models of divinity. In the ancient world, the divine basically and humans were interacted together. It was one and another. It was not uncommon for humans to become divine, for divine people to become human. So that was not an uncommon thing. It evolved to more of a separation as time went on, especially after Jesus was crucified in terms of this. But we had 3 models of divine humans at the time. One of which was gods that temporarily became human, such as Jupiter. Then we have divine beings born of a god and immortal. Zeus and Jupiter were very well known for coming down to earth to have sex with beautiful women. And that's where that came from, okay, in terms of this. Hercules is a product of that consummation, you might say, yes, in terms of
So
this.
there was a lot of this mythology at the time. People talked about and believed that gods could come down and become
Yes.
human,
Yes.
and some humans could become godlike.
Well, yes, God, divine being godlike, okay, in terms of that. That was very common in that time, in terms of this. And it took all the way up until basically several hundred years after Christ crucified that it really became separated the way we think of it today. A human had become divine. Romulus, who was the legendary founder of Rome, was that way. Julius Caesar, after he died, was considered to be God. And his adopted son, Octavian, was considered to be a god during his lifetime. Roman emperors became gods. Okay, and again, there was this thing called a conflict, competitiveness, you might say, between Jesus and some of the Roman emperors until things were resolved by Constantine many years down the road in terms of this. But it was widely debated in the world. And basically, what about Jesus? How did Jesus become God? Or basically, was he a God that became human? Was some of the initial early discussions. I'm going to read something out of the book here in chapter 44. Okay. This is going to be a preface for what we're going to be talking about in this next section coming up. This is right from Erlangen. It will become clear in the following chapters that Jesus was not originally considered to be God in any sense at all, and that he eventually became divine for his followers, and in some sense before he became thought of as, it equally became divine for his followers in some sense before he became thought of as equal with God Almighty in an absolute sense. What I point out, I stress this was in fact a development, the development of him becoming who we think of today. It did not start out that way. It did not start out that way during his ministry in terms of this. So the thing that was thought about Jesus at the time basically was that he was a rabbi, that he was a prophet, that he was a very human Messiah, which by itself has different meanings in itself, and basically that had various meanings, but he was not considered God, at least in terms of this. And that basically is what I wanted to talk about. And he was a teacher, I think, yeah, I mentioned that. He was that's the context I want to talk about within the first 2 chapters before we get into the next one, which is Jews in the ancient world. Jews also basically they believed in monotheism. Monotheism is basically one God, but it doesn't mean that they didn't have other gods. It goes back to the Old Testament where we're talking about the divinity of certain kings of Israel and stuff like this. There's an interesting quote that comes out, if you remember the 10 Commandments. What is the first commandment says? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. It doesn't say there's not any gods. It just you can't have any gods that are before the God, okay, in terms of that. So it doesn't mean that there weren't gods that existed during that time, which goes back to what Steve mentioned, that this was very common. The separation between divine and humans was not that clear at that particular time, okay? The God of Israel was considered to be basically divine in terms of it. Within Judaism, there basically were divine beings who temporarily became human. In Genesis, basically, Hagar meets an angel, and you talk about that to a degree. 82nd Psalms, basically, humans became angels. Enoch, if you remember, was the oldest living human at 365. When he left, he didn't die, he just walked away. God took him, and the inference was that he became an angel in terms of this. In Samuel and in Kings, the kings had a special relationship with God. God believed that kings could be the term son of God came from that interface or that interaction in terms of the kings of Israel and their belief in God. Okay, so again, it wasn't uncommon. Divine Jewish men, Moses was considered that way, as again was Enoch. So again, this thing was not, at that time, it was very cloudy, you might say, for lack of a better word, in terms of the separation. And that's all I wanted to say on basically on these first two chapters. I don't know if there's any questions. Yes, sir.
Don't we more or less perpetuate the idea of having more than one God every Sunday when we say the Lord's Prayer? Our God. That would imply that there are other gods and we're praying to our God.
Well, you know, one of
Instead
the
saying God who art in heaven, we say our God, our Father, who art in heaven.
No, you're right. And it was interesting kind of a takeoff on that, which will come up, I think, a little bit later, but how Jews separated from Christians. Why don't Jews basically believe as Christians do? There's several reasons for that, and I'm certainly not an expert on Jewish authority, but basically this going back to this concept of monotheism, okay? You know, we're talking about Jesus being the Son of God, but then there's only God, and then there's the Holy Spirit. I mean, how many do we have here? You know, is there one? Is there more? You know what I'm trying to say?
Sure.
In terms of this. And so you're right. I mean, there's some thought on that. Go
And
ahead.
isn't it still kind of a murky issue, Jesus' identity for a lot of Christians even today still? Because even going back to what Jesus said in the Bible, in some places he says, I am one with God, and in others he seems to be separated from God, and in others he seems to be pointing to God and not to himself. And so it seems to go back and forth. How do we really understand? And that's where the whole nature of Jesus and God issue comes from, I think.
Mhm.
That's what this book is addressing, isn't it?
Exactly, it is. And what he's trying to do is dig up historically what is the definition of this. One of the books that Ehrlichman first wrote was called Misquoting Jesus, which is an interesting book because it kind of tears apart the Bible, to be honest with you, for those very points that you're bringing out.
Well, I was just gonna say that Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane suggests he is more human than God.
Ben, he's what?
Then more human than God.
Yeah,
Why did you forsake
Yeah,
me?
yeah,
why did you give me this cup?
exactly. And again, some people are bothered by that, but I mean, historically speaking, it's a pretty strong point, which is going to be brought out in this next chapter, basically here, when we're talking about, did Jesus believe that he was God?
Also analogous to the Roman beliefs, in Japan in 1945, to get a peace treaty settled, they had to deal with the belief in Japan that the emperor was divine.
God, or divine like?
Right, yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. Here's a quote that Ehrlichman says. He says, I became impressed with the fact that the sayings of Jesus in which he claimed to be God were found only in the Gospel of John, the last, most theologically loaded of the four Gospels. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke really are saying very little about this in terms of this. And he says several New Testament heavyweights of the New Testament have said the one thing we all agree upon: Jesus did not spend his ministry declaring himself to be divine. So this is what we're going to get into is this, and we're going to talk about the Gospels and those that wrote them, and where did they get their information? What makes them authorities? Why should we think they're right? And what are the sources of information? And the sources of information need to be ancient. They can't be fairly new. They have to be as close as we can to the time of Christ. Those are critical things. Do you know who our earliest person was that basically talked to us about Jesus?
Q.
Well, Q, yeah, technically Q, but I mean, in terms of human that we know about it is Paul. You're right, Q was Paul. Paul was around, Jesus, it's expected or believed that Jesus died around 33 CE. And Paul was converted shortly thereafter, about 4 or so years thereafter. So around 37 approximately CE is when he came around in terms of this. He did a lot of self-study, you might say, for many years before he really went on to his ministry. His ministry didn't become active until about 45 or 50 CE, which is still several years before the Gospels were written by any of them, Mark being the first one in terms of that. But Paul doesn't speak a lot about, the teachings of Jesus. He does a interesting experiment with his students. He says, I want you to list basically all of the teachings, and I'm gonna be sure I got the quote in here, right? The teachings and writings of Jesus and what he talked about. And he basically says that they can't be listed on more than a 3x5 card, if that much. He's talking about a message, but he's not talking about Jesus distinctly in terms of that, which is an interesting thing to think about with Paul, who was obviously very prolific in his writings in terms of this. It's believed that Paul never openly declared Jesus to be divine. He did call him the Son of God in Romans, but he didn't speak a lot about the divinity of Jesus, more than the message of Jesus and what it was, which again is an interesting one. Mark, when we talk about the Gospels, and I'm going to give you a chart or show you a chart here in a moment, basically, Mark was the secretary of Peter, and Luke was a traveling companion of Paul. Okay, however, these Gospels of Mark and Matthew and Luke basically were written by anonymous sources totally. They came from names that they evolved, but not necessarily those people. They were a consortium of them. That's what I want to talk about over here for a second to give you, when we're talking about the sources of information. We have Mark up here that began around 65 or 70 when he wrote his stuff, okay? Basically, then we have Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke got information from Mark. There's obviously that in the Gospels by himself. They also had a source called Q that you mentioned over here, sir. Q basically also, it's interesting, stands for Quinella, which is the German word for source. So, but it's an unknown source. I don't know where it came from, okay? Also, Matthew and Luke had their own independent sources, which we're calling M and L, because we can't really identify them because they're not in with Mark. They're their own thinking. We don't know where they came from in terms of that. So these guys are all interchanged. And again, this is the dates. Matthew and Luke were 80 to 85. And then we have John down here between 90 and 95 CE, but he was separated from all of them. He didn't share any of this other information. He had his own agenda, you might say. And the point I want to bring out about that is, and I've talked to Reverend Jerry, I've talked to Reverend Andy, for those who know him, quite a bit about this book. And the one thing that got me from Reverend Jerry said, he said they all had an agenda. Okay, they wrote for a specific purpose in terms of this. So, and I mean, it was the teaching of Jesus, don't get me wrong. It's just that they had their own message that they wanted to say. And if you read John, it's much more theologically loaded than these other guys are in terms of that. But I thought that was an interesting interface there.
And some people don't like John. Some don't believe he was true. What he said was actually based on history. It was more his desire, I've heard some Christians say, because it was so different from the 3 other Gospels.
Right. You got to remember too, at this time, only about 10% of the population could read or write. Okay. So they were telling stories. That was the way that they didn't write things down until that. I'll read something else that comes out of the book from here in terms of this real quick. As soon as I find where I put it.
It's okay.
Scholars for 300 years have studied them in minute detail, and one of the assured truths of this internal investigation is the certainty that the Gospels have numerous discrepancies, contradictions, and historical problems. Why would that be? It would be better to ask, how could that not be? Of course, the gospel contains non-historical information and stories that have been modified, exaggerated, and embellished. These books do not contain the words of someone who was sitting at the feet of Jesus taking notes. There's nothing like that. They were books that were intended to tell the good news of Jesus. The word gospel here means good news. That their authors had a vested interest in both in what they were telling and how they were telling it. They wanted to preach Jesus. They were not trying to give biographical information that would pass muster among critical historians living 2,000 years later and had developed significantly different standards of writing. They were writing for their own day and trying to convince people that the truth as they saw it about Jesus. They were basing their stories on what they had heard and read. What they had read was based upon what authors of other writings had heard. It all goes back to oral tradition. So, and again, that's what he really comes down with in this quoting of Jesus. I'm sure that you guys have, you probably have heard of, who am I thinking of here? Marcus Borg, who spoke here many times, and he was a part of the Jesus Seminar. If you may have heard of that, the Jesus Seminar was an agreement, or not agreement, but a coalition of prominent theologians. Basically, what did exactly Jesus say? And they go through the Gospels in terms of that. And I don't know if it's still around, but Marcus Borg was heavily involved at the time in terms of this.
Doug, you wanted me to stop you at some
Yeah.
point and say, let's have a little wider discussion
Sure.
whenever you're ready,
Does anybody have any
that.
questions up to this point?
or comments. What do you think about generally the topic and what Doug's talking about?
Well, I've always had a progressive view, so it's right down my alley.
And it doesn't take away from your faith or your beliefs either. You can do both.
I'm glad you said that, because Erickman also makes that point. He's not trying to convert anybody either way. He's trying to give you a historical perspective, what has evolved. And always history is not the same as certainly as theology by any means. And I mean, it's got to be based upon facts in terms of that. Reverend Jerry tells a story about the fact that when they put together the New Testament, he said they had 5,500 pieces of scrap paper, more or less, that they had to put together. I mean, if you think about it, it's kind of scary when you know, all the things and all this sort of stuff. So, you know, I mean, we take stuff for granted only because we've heard it repetitiously for years and years, but if you get in digging it down to where it came from and how it evolved, sometimes doesn't follow our former beliefs or our beliefs net today in terms of that.
This reminds me of the question of the virginity of Mary, because we know we've heard many times that the original language said a young woman, and it didn't mean, the Greek words didn't mean a virgin. So we hear a lot of times in this church, people saying, it doesn't matter to me if she was a virgin or not. It's what Jesus did that matters. And so I think this kind of falls in line. It's a bigger topic, more loaded topic, but it kind of falls in line with that.
You ask about the Jesus Seminar, they are now known as the Westar Institute,
Oh, really?
WESTAR.
Okay. Are you familiar with him?
Oh, yes, and John Dominic Crossan was the Catholic theologian who was very good friends with, I pronounce it, Bart Ehrman.
Uh-huh.
And he also has written some wonderful things about the historical Jesus.
Okay.
So did Marcus Ford.
And Marcus Borg did too. Of course, Marcus Borg, as it sounds like he's been in this church, was trying to make progressive theology understandable and palatable to the evangelicals. That was his real passion.
Yeah.
Whereas Bart Ehrman is strictly academic in the historical context.
Perhaps it comes down to whether you see your religion as more of values that you adhere to, or facts and pseudo facts that you proclaim. And even in Christianity, well, certainly in Christianity today, there's those that say, don't tell me what you believe, show me your values, live your values. I'm more impressed by your demonstration of adhering to the values, whereas others say, just believe this stuff and you're all set. You can just tear up life, but as long as you adhere to just get the questionnaire right, and you're good. So,
Folks on Zoom, I hope you'll feel free to jump in here if you'd like to make any comment. Like to hear if you sound okay on the owl too. Susan, go ahead. I saw your hand go up. Please.
Steve, I was just saying thank you. I will, but I don't have any comment at this point other than I'm enjoying it very much and I find it interesting. Well, I will say, actually, I agree with Ron. As I was listening to this presentation, I was thinking, does any of this really matter? It's really just about what you believe and how you live your life. So I respect people that want to look at a historic perspective, and to those that want to take it as fact, that's great. But for me, it's just how are you living your life?
Well said.
Reverend Jerry talks about the historical Jesus movement, which Ehrlichman was a big part of several years ago. It's kind of faded away. It's still there, but not nearly as big as it used to be in terms of that. And again, he also indicates the separation. Again, I'm only telling you what historical, just the facts, man, just the facts, man. If you remember Dragnet, just the facts, man, just the facts. I can say that to an audience like this when I talk to little kids, they say, who,
yeah.
What's even scarier is somebody says, who was Elvis? I mean, it's really getting old, in terms of this. Let's talk about source validation. I think we have a slide on that.
Yes. Go.
Okay, what Ehrlichman goes through here is trying to have you understand how they tried to validate information from the original Gospels that came out on writings of that time, okay? And the first one is called Source of Independent Attestment, basically. The story is based on several independent traditions, and he uses the word traditions, i.e. stories, because basically that's kind of what they were. It's not that they weren't factual, but basically it's a more common word because, again, of the oral background of all the stuff that went on. Therefore, it's likely it goes back, and it has to go back to the ultimate source of tradition, the life of Jesus, okay? An example, John the Baptist, basically. They're all found, the story of John the Baptist is found in John, it's found in Mark, it's found in Q, all independently. Therefore, based upon the source of independent testament, there's a good chance it's true. In other words, Jesus interacted with John. There was a John and so forth. So because we have independent writings of those sources. Another one, Jesus being crucified under Pontius Pilate. This is found in Mark, John, M, and L. So in other words, 4 different independent sources that there really was a Pontius Pilate. He basically ordered the crucifixion of Jesus, etc. A counterexample of that, the wise men who followed the star to Jesus' birth. It's only found in Matthew. Therefore, what that does is it raises a big question mark over, did that really happen? It's not that it didn't happen, we only have one source that talks about it. And again, you got to remember that there was a lot of embellishment that went on during this time. We don't know whether that was embellished or not, but that was one way of testing the information that they're getting and looking at it from a historical perspective. The second is called the criteria of dissimilarity. If a tradition is dissimilar to what Christians would wanted to say about him, it's likely to be historically accurate. So in other words, going against the common thing about what you're thinking about with Jesus. The classic example of this probably is the birthplace in Nazareth. Nazareth was a hamlet. It was an unknown city in Israel, okay? Why would the Son of God be born in an unknown hamlet? You see what I'm trying to say? In other words, this did not follow a picture that we would want to paint of Jesus post-resurrection, okay? That, it would be better to say he was born in Jerusalem, that the angels came down and so forth and so on. But he was born in this hamlet, in a stable, basically, but that nobody knew about. So they think it's true, is what I'm trying to say. That's an interesting correlation, but it may go against what you would like to think would be the case in terms of this.
It's not something they would make up back then.
That's correct. It would not make it up.
Impress people about Jesus' power.
Right. He goes into a lot of detail about, and misquoting Jesus in his book in terms of that, the embellishment that was made by people that were writing, because remember, again, because of the few people that could read and write at that time, and basically and then also translating the text as it was from one language to another, embellishments that were added onto it. This is one that basically that they left alone and basically we feel is true because of that very statement. the baptism of Jesus under John the Baptist, basically. That is found, why would the Son of God have to be baptized? Are you with me? In other words, it would be the other way around. He would baptize John the Baptist. Therefore, it's probably true. It kind of goes against what we would think. You would think that he would come to John and basically baptize him, but he humbled himself, became baptized. And so they believe that basically that, combined with the fact that it comes from several independent sources, the belief is, yes, there was John the Baptist, he interacted with him, he was baptized, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of makes sense in terms of this? Now, the counterexample to that, in Mark says that Jesus has to go to Jerusalem and be rejected and be crucified and rise from the dead. That story is only found in Mark. It's not found anywhere else. That doesn't mean it's not true, but what it questions is it true? There's a difference there in terms of that. In what we're in. So that's the criteria of dissimilarity, which he uses when they're looking together these 5,500 scraps of paper and trying to figure out what happened at that time. Then there's a criteria of the last one here.
I wanted to show this,
Yeah,
Doug. This is
sorry.
an actual photograph of the baptism of Jesus that I found on the web. It must be true because it's on the internet. So I just wanted to share that with you.
One of the early digital cameras.
Early digital cameras, that's
It's
right.
fascinating that they're so white too.
Yes, white European. Yes.
Right.
Well, there shouldn't have been a cross there either.
That's
They were seeing things. They were seeing.
And John the Baptist is wearing some kind of a nice garment instead of,
Yes.
something with bugs in it.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. Doesn't he look nice too? Well, just shows to go you what an actual photograph can show.
It's been Photoshop.
Yeah, they photoshopped them.
I like the halos too.
Yes, the
Yeah.
halos add a nice touch, don't they, Jim?
That was a mainline photographer dipping the water for.
Right. I couldn't resist.
Photoshop scares the heck out of me because sometimes it's gotten so good, you really don't know what's
Right.
real and what isn't. It's
So
really
true.
scary, to be honest with you. So the last one is a criteria of contextual credibility. Did the stated tradition about Jesus actually fit first century Palestine? It's critical to understand Jesus' historical context if we want to understand what he said and did during his life. The reason that's brought in is that, for example, the Gospel of Thomas, which was not originally obviously included in the New Testament, was written later compared to the other ones, sometime I think 2nd century or late 1st century, in terms even after John. And he conveys certain things that would not necessarily fit the historical time of Jesus, if that makes sense in terms of this. So that was the third criteria when they're trying to figure out whether this information, or part of what they're trying to figure out, is this stuff true or not true in terms of it. Did I have anything after this? I may not have. Yeah. No, I threw in my own. I said that to me this was the key, I think, in throwing out some of the stuff that was not done at the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea, by the way, was done, I think, 315 AD, 300 or 320 AD, basically almost 300 years after Jesus was crucified. But it took another 100 years to the Council of Chalcedon in 470, I believe, to basically come up with this official statement that basically Jesus was God. Okay, so there was debate literally for 300 or 400 years before they came up with an official resolution, and they got together to cease the debate. They issued the Nicene Creed to try to disavow all the different views that they had about Jesus in terms of that. Then that came out of the Council of Nicaea. Getting a little bit ahead of myself because that comes out a little bit later, but in that council, there were approximately 315 bishops that came, only 5 from the West. And the reason was they couldn't get there. I mean, it was obviously ancient times in terms of this. So, I mean, a lot of stuff going on when you get back to the history of what went into the New Testament, why did it go into? I think that's a whole different study by itself, and probably full of controversy is full of controversy by itself in terms of that. when we talk about this view, going back to what evolved, what Jesus believed, basically, it was widely held throughout the Jewish world and by Jesus, at least the feeling is that this was a time that God would overthrow very soon and intervene with this world of pain and suffering, overthrow them and bring in a new kingdom with no more misery or justice, or injustice, excuse me. The time of the worth, as we knew it, was ending. That was a strong belief at that time. It was attested, it was very prominent in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was believed by the Pharisees. It's listed in many Jewish texts outside of the Bible. And it was most certainly held by Jesus. Jesus preached about it, okay, the end of the world. And I'll give you a little hint of what happened is as history evolved, the world didn't end. And some changes came about in terms of this apocalyptic happening of what it was. Thomas actually writes against it, says there was no such thing. And then, I mean, I'm condensing what he said. But basically because how could Jesus be wrong? Well, the way it was wrong is they changed the meaning of it. I mean, but this was not totally throughout there, but the feeling definitely within the Jewish world is that the world had a short time span left. But that doesn't mean it was going to be erased like in the time of Noah where we had a flood. It's just that the forces of evil were going to come about and change it, okay? And the feeling was that Jesus was going to evolve to be the king of the Jews in terms of that. And there was going to be 12 tribes, and 12 tribes would be the 12 disciples. But he was not the Son of Man that was going to be the one that really evolved this thing to happen. He talks about the Son of Man, but the disciples call him the Son of Man. That's in the gospel in many places. Does that kind of make sense where I'm coming from as far as what his message that he came out with? Okay, that was going on in terms of this.
But what does that really mean, though? The Son of Man? What did Jesus mean by that?
The Son of Man basically was going to be the one that was going to make the world right. Okay, that he was going to straighten out the evil and the corruption that the Romans and everybody else in the world, sin that was going on,
Okay.
you know, in terms of this, and it was going to be a holy kind of a thing. The definition is kind of vague in terms of that, as far as I know, but basically that he was going to more or less be the ruler, you could say, which to me is interesting by itself because it doesn't, you know, where did he relate to quote God, you know, in terms of that? Was that God, or another way of saying there was that God?
Mhm.
But the point is that Jesus was going to be, and I'm getting ahead of myself because the King of the Jews is something that they feel Jesus did not talk about externally, but he talked about it internally with his disciples. And the reason I say that is that the feeling was that we don't know why Judas betrayed Jesus, but we feel that the reason was that he talked about Jesus, when Jesus talked to his disciples, he talked about being the king of the Jews, and that was a threat to the Romans because it restricted their authority, and therefore he had to be killed. It kind of makes sense where I'm coming from on that. You know, but he didn't necessarily, but as we know, it was on the cross, you know, or is talked about in Mark, you know, in terms of that. So some interesting things there in terms of it, okay? This apocalyptic message that I'm talking about is quoted, for example, and he does scripture sources, Mark 13, Luke 17, Matthew 13, plus L, M, and Q. It's all over the Bible. It's all throughout the Bible. But there's very little doubt that basically that this was not the environment and the beliefs that were going on at the time in terms of this. And as I mentioned, it was toned down and virtually eliminated later on. I think the canon of John does not list very much of this at all, if any at all, in terms of that. And again, because Jesus had died, the disciples had died, and nothing had happened. The world was still around in terms of this. So basically, Jesus was not God, at least that belief at that time, and among himself, he was something else, which basically was the Messiah, which was the anointed one, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But I wanted to read something else out of the book here from the page.
Doug, we got about 10 minutes left.
Okay.
Just to give you a time check, and
I
if you want to leave time for discussion also.
Sure. Let me just read real quick in here in terms. This came from Mark. This is Mark 8:38 to talk about what we're talking about. Jesus. Whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, again, apocalyptic type message. Of that one will be the Son of Man, be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. He's not saying he's the Son of Man, okay? He's talking about the Son of God, man who's gonna come, and basically, this in terms of this. Now, anyone who actually thinks that Jesus is the Son of Man may casually assume here that he's talking about himself. Whoever is ashamed of Jesus, Jesus will be ashamed of him, that he will judge him when it comes to from heaven. But that's not actually what the saying says. Instead, it says, if anyone is ashamed of Jesus, of that person, the Son of Man will be ashamed when he comes from heaven. Okay? Nothing in this saying makes you think Jesus is talking about himself. A reader who thinks Jesus is talking about himself as the Son of Man has brought that understanding to the text. The text has not taken it from the text. Another example in terms of that. Okay, this was probably not the way early Christians would have made up a saying about the Son of Man. Okay. Any questions so far on this? Okay.
Are you going to talk about when the gospel writers declared Jesus becomes divine?
Yeah,
Is that-
well, I'm gonna try to, and the reason I say I try to, because I frankly, when I told Steve about this class, and we first had one lesson, he says, no, it's gotta be 2 lessons, we agreed on that, and he says, I called him back the other day, he says, it's really gotta be 3 lessons, and he said, we couldn't do it because he's got other speakers. There's so much here, in all honesty, and again, I'm trying to be as honest as I can and complete as I can with all the volume that I have here. So my intent is to try to get to that, yes,
Okay.
okay, in terms of that, I can't promise, but that's my intent, you know.
Are you gonna be here 2 Sundays?
They're not gonna hold your feet.
Yeah, we're gonna do what I'm gonna do is next week, because we're really gonna get into, basically the crucifixion. Because I can tell you right now that what changed everything was the crucifixion and the resurrection, okay? And the 2 key chapters there, what do we know about the resurrection and what don't we know about the resurrection? And the one that we don't know is basically for those that are more traditional in faith, they're really gonna probably test your faith a little bit, because he's gonna bring out some things that would change our view of the resurrection, at least parts of it, not all of it. But again, to go back to it, also interjects your faith in the fact that there's some good. So what I'm trying to say is, it's an emotional roller coaster when he talks about the resurrection to a degree, up and down, in terms of how you believe.
Doug, we got 7 minutes left. Would you be comfortable just having discussion?
Sure.
In the last 7 minutes? You
Yeah.
covered everything you want to today?
No, I've got 2 more hours to go. I don't have the time. So.
Oh,
Steve, I have a quick question.
yes.
I've not heard of Q before, but is that what these people, the QAnon folks, are they referring to the Q that you're referring to?
QAnon came much later than Q. Much later. He's an unidentified source that at least I know, you can help me there, sir, is that we've never been able to identify. Do you have anything on that?
No, you're exactly correct. From the readings I've done, it's same
Yeah.
message. Yeah, they don't know what the source is.
It's an
They don't know where it
assumption.
went or anything like that, but they're pretty sure it was written down.
Yes.
Yeah.
It
Aren't
wasn't
these
just- It
all,
wasn't just verbal, and the reason is that there's good tracking in both Matthew and Luke.
Yes.
With Q, and that it follows the same wordage and the same phrasing and things like that. So they're pretty sure that it was written down, but they don't know where it went.
It's purely an assumption based on the fact that those facts are similar in those books.
Here's, to hit that point there, sir, real quick. It says, in a saying preserved for us in Q, Jesus tells his 12 disciples that in the age to come, when the Son of Man is seated upon his glorious throne, you will be seated upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, so that came directly out of Q in terms of this. And again, that was, so the feeling is that Jesus shared a lot of stuff internally with the disciples that were not necessarily spoken externally.
And there was so much literature that was destroyed in the early years of 300. When they were trying to bring it down to what was the accepted orthodoxy, they actually destroyed many fragments and books and everything else because they didn't want the competition. And the reality is, in early Christianity, there were many multiple interpretations of Christ. And they were kind of all, okay, you believe that, that's fine, I believe this. And it was Paul that kind of said, no, they kind of bring this together. And then it was finally Constantine who said, enough is enough, we need one Bible.
One thing I wanted to mention, I'm glad you said that about Constantine. A lot of people feel that the reason that all this evolved, that Jesus was different than the other earlier people that preached what they preached, and you know, that he was Jesus, the Son of Man, or Son of God, I should say, excuse me, and all this, was the rapid birth of Christianity that had propagated so quickly that it had to be true. Okay, part of it is when Constantine said this would be the official religion of the Roman world, the Romans ruled the world. Okay, so basically we had this big arm of the law, you might say, saying you're going to be a Christian now in terms of that. But the other thing that we don't realize is, does that mean that there was not God in Buddha, that there was not God basically, you know, in Islam, that there wasn't God in any other religion? But the one that really got me was that the growth rate of Christianity in the first 300 years was about 40% a year, I believe it was. I wrote it down here, which is the same exact growth rate of the Mormon religion today.
What?
The Mormon religion today.
Oh,
Okay, in other words, yes, it evolved quickly, but not necessarily separately, because the Mormon religion grew at quite a bit of pace. Constantine came in and said, you're going to be this way, you know, and that contributed to the growth of Christianity. I'm not downplaying it. I'm just saying that was a historical fact to bring that about. So in other words, it kind of goes against the thing what had to be true because everybody believed. What there was circumstances behind everybody believing, you might say. And again, as somebody had said earlier, this doesn't necessarily create doubt upon your faith. It just creates, to me, deeper questions about it. Because, and things, you know, and he says it here more than once. He says, you know, historians are not, you know, you have to disseminate faith from history, is what it boils down to. Okay, and you can, you know, and there's historians that believe and there's historians that don't believe.
And by studying history, it can actually make you clearer and wiser in your faith, make you feel stronger so you don't have those doubts that are unresolved in your thoughts.
When was the great library in Alexandria, Egypt burned? I think most scholars feel that there was a tremendous storehouse there of ancient books and materials that really wiped out a lot of history we'd sure like to know. I'll have to look that up.
Yeah.
And writing materials, you know, we take it for granted. You know, we can get a book from Amazon or go down to the stationery store or Target and get all the paper and pencils we want. Paper and writing materials were very rare in the ancient world and precious and expensive.
And this idea of embellishing when you write in a way that was a form of entertainment, pre-enlightenment, when people didn't have a variety of entertainment options. So the writers would embellish their stories because it made it more interesting to their readers. And so after the Enlightenment, then we began to have critical thinking and developing the difference between science and religion and all these separations.
well,
And that tradition
when the Gospels,
continues today.
when the Gospels were written, more or less bookended the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And an enormous amount of material was lost, stuff that was in the temple in Jerusalem when it was destroyed. Well, when Jerusalem was destroyed,
Right.
which was somewhere in the vicinity of, as I remember, 60, I think, or 65 or something.
One last interesting footnote is on the name Jesus Christ. Most people at that time did not have last names. They might have had where they came from or whatever like that. But Christ is a Greek translation of the Hebrew word for Messiah. And Messiah in the ancient times was considered to be the anointed one. So that's somewhere where that saying came from to a degree.
Great. Well, thank you, Doug of Georgetown. We appreciate all the work you put into it today and a good discussion. And look forward to next week.
Yeah, I will try to bring, we will definitely hit the resurrection and the two things that actually, as he says, changed the world in terms of what happened. But again, with some things that might challenge you a little bit in what you've thought about before in terms of the resurrection.
I wouldn't mind seeing you do a triple lesson.
I would love to do it. You got to talk to Steve about that.
Okay.
Take a look at when that could be. We might give you a rest of a couple weeks.
Sure.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. Hope you have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.